She was the third Prime Minister of India, a central figure of the Indian National Congress Party, and the only woman to date to hold the position of PM. 30 years ago today, she was gunned down by her own bodyguards. On the anniversary of her death, you'd be forgiven for thinking the assassination of a sitting Prime Minister in India hadn't happened. The current PM, Narendra Modi, choosing instead to commemorate the birthday of the country's first Home Minister. But why is the death of Indira Gandhi being largely ignored? With this special report, here's Jeff Moody.
June 1984. 6 months before Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was assassinated by her own bodyguards, and there's trouble in Punjab. The Khalistan movement was gaining momentum, leading to a deterioration of law and order, according to Gandhi. The Khalistan movement wanted to create a separate Sikh country. Translated as land of the pure, they fought for their homeland for centuries. When India was carved out and partitioned off at the end of the Second World War, the Sikhs hoped for a bite of the cherry, hoped for their own land in and around the Punjab region of South Asia. It wasn't to be. Following Indian independence from Britain in 1947, the Sikhs campaigned hard for their own region. The Indian government resisted. There were Sikh protests, answered by violent clampdowns from the government. But eventually, after the Indo-Pak War of 1965, the government finally agreed to petition the state of Punjab. The Sikhs had won a partial victory. But it wasn't enough. During the 70s and early 80s, the Khalistan movement grew and grew. No longer happy with a portion of one state, the Sikhs now wanted their own country, their own land of the pure. They garnered international support, they raised funds, and in 1980 they met with the Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and declared the National Council of Khalistan. They printed their own stamps, printed their own currency, they were forming their own country. But Indira Gandhi wasn't happy. There was, she said, a growing arm of Sikh militancy, and it worried her. The militants were amassing weapons in the Golden Temple in Amritsar. In June 1984, the Indian Army, on the orders of Indira herself, stormed the Golden Temple. They overpowered armed militants and the Sikhs' religious leader. It was called Operation Blue Star. The attack lasted 5 days. There was a media blackout, electricity and water cuts, and the army tanks destroyed the area of Akal Takht, occupied by the Sikh militants. In addition, historical artifacts and religious manuscripts were burned. There was uproar. Was the Indian government heavy-handed? The loss of life was extreme. The desecration of the holiest Sikh shrine, the last straw. There was widespread mutiny. Sikhs left the Indian army, resigned from armed and civil administrative offices. Many returned their awards and honours they had received from the Indian government. And then, on the 31st of October 1984, the ultimate revenge. Indira Gandhi, shot dead by her bodyguards. They were Sikhs. The death of the Prime Minister sent shockwaves around the world and sparked a wave of anti-Sikh violence. Sikhs were pulled off buses and trains and doused with kerosene and burnt alive. They were dragged from their homes and attacked with blades. Some 8,000 Sikhs lost their lives. They called it genocide. Indira Gandhi's son, Rajiv, was sworn in as Prime Minister, and the Gandhi dynasty carried on. For 3 decades, the debate has raged. Was she right to send in the troops? Was she too heavy-handed? Now, 30 years on, the Gandhi dynasty is gone, replaced by Narendra Modi. And whilst he's outwardly said nothing, what's not said is plain. Today, India remembers another politician, not the woman who was assassinated in office. And Modi has gone further. He's given each of the victims' families compensation. A clear sign, some say, that Modi thinks she was heavy-handed. A clear sign, maybe, that wounds between the Indians and the Sikhs are finally healing. Jeff Moody, Arise News.
Well, let's stay with this story because I'm now joined in the studio by Jagraj Singh, who's founder of the Sikh charity Everything's 13, who as a young child was forced to flee India with his family when the violence erupted following the assassination of Indira Gandhi. A very good day to you and thank you so much for giving us your time. I mean, take us back to that time when your family had to leave the country. What was the atmosphere like?
Maybe a bit of a... didn't leave the country, but we had to certainly be very careful at that time because, well, I was 5 and we were travelling by train at that time, just post Indira Gandhi being assassinated, and they were killing Sikhs on all the trains.
So these were random killings? No,
not just random, they were organised. This is the worst part of it, is actually they were actually organised by the state apparatus, as you might say. You know, the voting lists were given to people to say where the Sikhs lived. They were armed with weapons, they were armed with kerosene, and they were given free mandate by the police that they could do what they liked. And they were armed gangs taken out of prison, sent to go and kill Sikhs. So they were killing Sikhs everywhere, and it's very organised.
Because this is what are the accusations that arose after the storming of the temple at Amritsar, that the violence that followed, this was done effectively with the blessing of the authorities, and the police had an active hand, and the authorities simply looked the other way.
Well, today is the 31st of November, and on this day, Indira Gandhi was killed in the morning in India, and in the evening there was a big meeting at one of the heads of the Congress party in Delhi, where everybody was involved in planning the murder of all the Sikhs. So this was very much a state orchestrated violence. I was only 5 years old at the time, and I remember that my parents dressed me up dressed me in girls' clothes. They took my hair, they put up in plaits because they were killing Sikhs, and one of the ways was that you had a turban. So they just took my hair, dressed me up as a girl, and said, "Look, speak Hindi," and then that's how I survived. So in a way, Sikhs had to face very awkward choices. And thousands were killed. And then the worst part is that the official figures are always downplayed. So
and that was another point I wanted to raise with you, actually, the numbers, because you've got the official data about the numbers that were killed in the violence, but will we ever know what the true figure is?
Well, if you take in what happened in June and in November, you will never know how many people died, because in June, for example, as soon as the attack happened, all the bodies were put into trucks and carted away and then burnt. And there was no account kept. Now, in a democratic nation, if you've got people dying, you will surely account who was who, try to identify them. They just burnt all the bodies, you know, and there's no figures kept. And then again, same thing happened in November. Bodies were carted away, they were already burnt or killed, and then again they were just cremated, and no accounts were kept. So many people didn't know what happened. No accounts were not kept, but in a way, it's kind of like in India, no one trusts the government police, the government figures. So the fact that you know, it's just an unfortunate situation. The BBC and all the press and all the other newspapers always take the government figures, right, which have been discredited widely by everybody.
But there is obvious scepticism, as you've explained to me. Look, let's go back to Jeff Moody's report and let's look at the Khalistan independence movement. I mean, give us a sense of how prominent they were as a group and the amount of traction they had in the Sikh communities.
Well, the first thing would be to just examine whether that was a Khalistan independence movement, because this is kind of the straight propaganda. So imagine if people are asking for their fair rights under the Indian Constitution, i.e. Indian Constitution is supposed to be a federal government, where each state can actually effectively have its own language and its own kind of culture. So Gujarat, they speak Gujarati. In Tamil Nadu, they speak Tamil. The Sikhs are saying, well, in Punjab, let's have Punjabi. Let our kids learn Punjabi in school, which is exactly what the Indian Constitution says that they should have, is states organised by language. But the Punjabis weren't given Punjabi as their first language. They were being told to leave Punjabi and embrace Hindi. So the Sikh movement, there was not a Sikh independence movement, there was a Sikh cultural movement.
So that's what they were pressing for, cultural rights?
They were pressing for things that were, cultural rights, which were under the Constitution. And unfortunately, the government didn't want to give them those rights because they wanted to actually suppress Sikhism, which takes, obviously, Punjabi as its main scriptural language. So in order to suppress them, they defamed it as a Khalistani, separatist movement.
Because the government line was that they were militants in the group, and by virtue of that, they posed a danger, which would be the undertone of that statement.
Well, they didn't pose a danger to any Sikhs. They didn't pose a danger to anybody else. I mean, they were living... The people that they said they went to get in from in June 1984, they were in Amritsar, in the Golden Temple, but not in the Golden Temple. It's a big complex, and within the complex, you've got the temple itself within the pool of water, and then on the Amritsar, and then you've got on the side the Akal Takht. And the Akal Takht is the political capital of the Sikhs. Even the sixth Guru, when he formed that, he kept an army there. So it's never been a holy place in the kind of Western sense where there's no arms or anything there.
Right.
There's always been the temple itself, which has been a peaceful place to worship.
So that was the
and there's
place
been
of
the political
reverence.
centre where all the soldiers actually used to be kept. So that's where they were, and it's perfectly right for them to be there. Also, just something that a lot of people don't understand, there was no siege before the Indian government turned up. On that, the police, the army turned up. People were walking in and out of Golden Temple, having food, spending their time there, roaming around, perfectly safe. So these people were not a threat to anybody. They were just in there. And the government said, oh, they're a threat, and they went to attack them. But imagine if you had to take a group of people out of a situation, you surrounded them, what at least you would say is come out. Right? They never ever gave a warning to say, if you come out now, we will not attack.
Right,
they just attacked.
But people in that quarter, they were unarmed.
There were people that were armed, which is our right as Sikhs to carry arms. And even under the Constitution of India, we're allowed to carry arms. So there were people that were armed, and there was thousands of other people who were totally unarmed and totally just turned up for the day because it just happened to be one of the most important days in the Sikh calendar. So it was planned. They actually, all the press says the same thing. They stopped people leaving. So imagine if you wanted to limit civilian casualties.
So they were effectively corralled into
they were
that area.
corralled, and they were letting trains and buses come into Amritsar. No one was allowed to leave Amritsar. They were letting people go into the Golden Temple, but no one was allowed to leave the Golden Temple. So you actually had fish in a barrel. Everybody was stuffed inside this little place, and then they attacked without any warning. There was the Deputy Commissioner of Delhi, of Amritsar, who's in the police. He begged the government to give him an arrest warrant for Sant Janar Singh Ji, who was inside the Golden Temple, say, please give me an arrest warrant. I will arrest him. Because you could go inside. No one will stop you going inside.
So he was basically saying, look, let me arrest this
and
man.
I'll bring this person out.
And then everything else will...
And the police and the army refused. Indira Gandhi refused.
Right, so she wanted a confrontation, basically.
She wanted to destroy the backbone of the Sikhs. In fact, her own personal aide-de-camp, or her own personal secretary, wrote in his memoirs that Indira Gandhi said when she finishes, I've broken the back of the Sikhs.
But why? But if that was the case, why was she so determined to get back at the Sikhs?
I would say there's two main reasons. Firstly, the fact that the Sikhs had been again and again asking for their rights within the Indian government, and Indira Gandhi really didn't want to give that. She is very much Hindu nationalism against Sikh and Punjabi, not nationalism, but a freedom movement. It was a human rights movement. And they wanted to suppress the Sikhs because, unfortunately, if you remember in 1970, I don't know if you remember that, but in 1978, Indira Gandhi was convicted of electoral fraud and kicked out of power. And in her response to that was to take over power and get rid of the government. So she became a dictator for a little while. And it was the Sikhs at that time, although they're only 5% of the Indian population, at that time the Sikhs protested the heaviest.
Right, so she blamed them for what happened at that time?
For getting her back out of power and getting rid of the emergency, yeah, she did. So there was sort of like a personal vendetta against these pesky Sikhs who always talk about human rights and freedoms and don't want to just shut up and listen to what we tell them to do, you know? So there was this element there.
But then looking back, so I'm sorry to have to jump in there because obviously we've got a time frame to work within. But looking back in terms of what happened and what many Sikhs worldwide saw as the violation of the Golden Temple, would you say that what effectively happened to her was predictable? The assassination.
Oh, 100%. She would have known that this is something like this going to happen because the Sikhs have never taken anybody attacking the Golden Temple lightly. This is the place that was made by the 5th Guru. You know, our Gurus lived there. That town did not exist before the Gurus made it. The temple did not exist before the Gurus made it. It's a very important place for us. And it's the same as how the Gurus made it back then. So she must have known there would be a retaliation. And Satwan Singh, Byan Singh and Kehar Singh, for us, they are like martyrs because they effectively did what needed to be done. You know, and straight away. It wasn't like a massive gap. It was within 5 months she was assassinated. And no Sikhs, even very few Sikhs now, would even now say that they were wrong for doing what they did because everybody hails them up as heroes. The thing that happened next in November in Delhi is where you suddenly see the truth of the Indian government coming out. Because what you've got is an organised massacre of the Sikhs. So there's no longer any illusion of you being our common citizens and we protect your rights and we're all common citizens. It was just like, you know, we're going to kill the Sikhs now and just try to wipe them out from India.
Right, so hence the references to genocide. But I mean, let's move on now to India today. Do you feel that Narendra Modi is taking the right line in not acknowledging this as the anniversary of Indira Gandhi's death, but actually putting the focus on somebody who is lesser known?
Well, he's offered 5 lakh compensation for That's not a lot of money. Let's just make that clear. In India nowadays, things have changed a lot.
Sure.
You know, when I left India in 1990, that might have been a lot of money, but now it's not a lot.
Yeah,
but
inflation and the like.
That being on the side, the people that committed those acts, who we know, in November 1984, there was a paper published called "Who Are the Guilty?"
So these are the ones responsible for the violence post Indira Gandhi's death.
For the last 30 years, we've known exactly who is responsible, and none of them have been really prosecuted at all. So it's a slap in the face for all those victims when they see the people that committed those acts walking around free, some of them in government.
So in other words, if he was serious about healing the divide and also respecting justice, that the guilty would actually be brought before a court and tried by their peers.
And it's not the case that it's happening, because only last year one of the main guys was again let off and acquitted. So we've got this continual kind of slap in the face of the Sikhs to say we're not going to prosecute those people because we actually helped them to do it. The government actually protected them, and the police was involved. So if you had to convict one person,
you convict all effectively.
And then effectively you're going to have this massive issue where these guys have been able to get away with it because they were told to do so by the higher echelons.
But what about the way that Indians today view Indira Gandhi? Because as you've said, it's only now that the truth is coming out.
Right.
So do you feel that perhaps a lot of the reverence has been removed from her legacy, especially given what has happened to the dynasty in the recent elections, because they were pretty much obliterated at the polls by Narendra Modi? You
know, India is a bit of a police state. It's not. It's a democracy, as they say, but it's a bit of a police state. You can't actually say much without getting... There's people that have been tweeted against Narendra Modi who were arrested for just tweeting. Right? On his birthday or something, you know? They say we shouldn't be celebrating his birthday and spending all this money. So India is still a police state, and in 1984 it was even more so. And people knew what she'd done was wrong, but they couldn't speak up. And they've known about this for many years. Only now that people are able to kind of express that because it's a different government and you can criticise. You know, it's like post-Thatcher, post the Falklands War, you couldn't say, well, that was the wrong thing to do because it's just general mood happened to be that way.
So people are now more critical of her in appraising her legacy?
Yeah, I mean, her legacy was to increase communal conflict. The other thing she did also, she neutralised a lot of poor males.
And these were the vasectomy programmes.
Yeah, exactly. So she was actually a bit of a dictator. But unfortunately, she was hailed up as Mother India. But that was only a propaganda thing created by her. She was not Mother India. Mother India is a bigger concept than this one lady who actually went around exploiting the poor and creating discontent just to keep herself in power. And her family still endures. The worst part of it is that her family still endures. Given her legacy, they should really be kicked out.
Sure, although the argument is that the influence of the Nehru dynasty does appear to be on the wane. But listen, Jagraj, time goes against us. Thank you so much for joining us in the studio and taking us through that, a very controversial subject, and it's good to have an alternative view. Thank you.
Thank you.